very valuable to us. But I also think if you listen to President Trump's press conference with the Prime Minister, he did stick by Article 5. It is a congressional decision put there by Marco Rubio, Secretary Rubio, that America cannot leave NATO without congressional agreement. And although there is, you're quite right, there is a difference of view in the Trump administration from many of its predecessors about Europe, they do help us. They will help us. We're in the South China Seas for our interests, not just America's. And they have assisted us. They still have troops in the Balkans, for example. So it's a much more symbiotic relationship, I think, than you were implying. I turn to Nigel.
I was going to go on just to talk more generally about the tension, Lord Bruce, that you were talking about between the United States and Europe, an old, a familiar tension. I think the Prime Minister is right to try to hang on to what we can of the relationship with the US and their commitment to European security. As we've seen from the last few days, that's going to be tough, but I think it's the right objective, and on trade and trade as well. But I do think in terms of what's going to change, we've been left since Brexit, we the UK, more exposed to the United States. And the US has been going through a difficult period with Trump 1 and the pressures on the Biden administration in the foreign policy area. That affects the UK probably more than anybody, because we are so closely connected to the way that the US conducts its foreign policy. So I think, in a way, strategically, the most important thing for us, as well as maintaining what we can of the UK-US relationship, is moving ahead with Keir Starmer's initiative with Europe. And that has at least two fundamental elements to it. The first is the security, defence, foreign policy element that we've been talking about this morning, caused by this new world order that confronts us and a diminished, at least, American support for NATO and for Europe. But the second is obviously the review of the trade and cooperation agreement that we negotiated 5 years ago, the defects of which are apparent in British public opinion and need over time to be corrected. I think that if we are able, and there's an EU summit in May for the UK, if we are able to create a much closer relationship between the UK and Europe on defence, for all the difficulties of that, which go back a long time, including some real-life efforts in areas of defence procurement and kit. If that is possible, it ought to be not only acceptable but supported by the United States, because it goes in the direction that they're asking us to go. Whether it does without an unpleasant interview here or comment there is we'll have to see. But I think it ought to be saleable to them. The second is much more difficult, because in Trump's first term, he was encouraging the UK government of the day to go for complete rupture with the Europeans, and that's obviously the mood today. So that will, I think, take some explaining to the United States, but this is an area where our government will have to be firm, and this to me is not up, should not be up for negotiation. We're going to have to do that if we're going to rebalance our own long-term security interests and respond to a world which requires us and other Europeans to act much more confidently on our own.
Thank you. Obviously the challenge for us is to sort of unpick what's happening in the here and now and try and identify some long-term trends. So I want to come back to the international and multilateral organisations in this new world order. One would think that they might provide some sort of ballast in our relationship with the US, although I don't think any of us could have imagined the US voting with Russia and North Korea at the UN a few weeks ago. But how much is our membership of these organisations, and whether it's the UN, NATO, Five Eyes, AUKUS, how important is that to our ongoing future relationship with the US? and just as a sort of subsidiary question to that, I think, Karen, you touched on the attitude of the younger generation, and you mentioned, the 17-year-old graduates at West Point. Our research seems to say that there is a sort of generational shift going on in domestic American public opinion around their attitude to how important not only the UK but actually how important America should concentrate overseas is becoming. So I just wondered if you could comment on those two shifts, if you like.
I've served at the UN, as you know, as well as in Washington. We don't always have the same interests in the multilateral organisations, but more often than not, even with the Trump administration, we do, and we work through that. I'm afraid it won't just be on the Ukraine resolution in the General Assembly. I suspect some of the differences will start to show on some of the more social policy resolutions that will come with the Commission on the Status of Women, for example. And we will have to work through those as we did before. We add in the international multilateral dimension to all aspects of government dealings with the Americans, whether the Americans are members of X or not. So, for example, President Trump wishes to pull out of WHO, we would still discuss world health issues, pandemic issues with the United States, and we would discuss how, if you like, the international system is doing anyway. So it's an important part of the conversation that particularly the Foreign Secretary has with his counterparts, but obviously it's not the only aspect. Something like CPTPP, where we are members and they are not, but Canada is a member, Mexico is a member, that's a very interesting contribution to any debate about prosperity in the Pacific area. So again, it forms part of the regular discussions that the Foreign Secretary would have. On the younger generation, there's some really fascinating polling that I can't remember all of, but we could easily send you, the embassy could send you. It depends which questions you ask. On the whole, Britain comes out either top or near the top, as Nigel and Peter were saying. Australia comes out pretty high. But some of that is very much around Australian cultural things like surfing. So it does depend a little bit on what question you're asking. But certainly if you go round the US and visit institutions, whether they're state level, whether they're city halls, there is enormous interest and affection for the UK. And a kind of understanding that we are cousins, if you like, and that we start from the same place, even though we don't always agree.
Can I say a word about your question on multilateralism? Because I think there is a philosophical difference, probably. I think for us, as a medium-sized power, we believe that it's very important that there's a rules-based international order which is policed, if you like, or at least there is a framework provided by multilateral institutions which we all belong to, and we observe the rules. I don't think that is the same view in Washington, and I defer to Karen on this, but I think it probably, you can point also to some extent, this is true of the Democratic Party now as well as the Republican Party. But my view is that this administration, in the person of Trump, will see multilateralism in a completely transactional way, and unless it's useful, it gets in the way. And you would rather deploy American power on a one-to-one basis than have to go through the bureaucratic procedures and the voting procedures of being in an institution, that is an inhibition to your exercise of power. So I think there is a fundamental difference. It's partly about our size. It's also, I think, partly about values and attitude to international relations. It was quite clearly, performance politics to pull out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement on day one, to walk out of WHO, which Trump has accused of misleading everybody on COVID, and so on. And you point to this extraordinary, absolutely unprecedented vote in the UN. And even if it's gesture politics on one level and it's showmanship, it comes back to this question of trust, and can you work with people who are going to, subject you to this kind of shock? I think multilateralism is very important for us. I think, again, it's an issue we need to be absolutely clear. We're committed to it. I also think it could easily backfire on the Americans if they take it too far. Multilateralism isn't going to go away. There may be a vacuum because the Americans leave. It may be filled by the Chinese. And other Western countries will suffer for that, because we will have, without the American voice in place in key institutions, whether it's climate change or whatever it is, we are weakened, in my view. So I'm not sure that it will in the long run help the United States very much if they do that. But I think to your point, I think we need to be clear that we do not see multilateralism in the same way.
Thanks. Just a couple of general points. One is that I think we have to be ready for the reality that whether it's in the international organizations or whether it's in terms of our own determination to reset relations with Europe while fixing relations with America or keeping them in good repair, there will be some nasty surprises. We often will not be consulted very closely, even after the very close consultation between President Trump and the Prime Minister. We didn't know, the British government was not tipped off that he was about to suspend all military assistance to Ukraine immediately afterwards. I don't think we knew that they were going to vote as they did. I'd be fascinated to know how it actually happened at the United Nations General Assembly on that ludicrous resolution which declined to apportion blame for the Ukraine war to the Russians for having invaded. It will be like that. It was always a bit thus. Sometimes the process of consultation in the US system was for them to whir the cogs and work out what they wanted and then call up the allies and saying, here's what we're doing, are you with us? Rather than consult at an earlier stage of the policy-making process. I think we made a lot of progress in recent years. Maybe at the moment we're going a little bit backwards, but we're going to have to live with that. And in a sense, Lord Darrick's question, how do you advise the Prime Minister to deal with all this stuff? I think it's about not so much challenge and confront, which we may need to do sometimes with the Chinese, but nudging and adjusting in a different direction. That may be part of the answer on tariffs. I think it certainly needs to be the answer on the commitment that this government is making, quite rightly, on Europe. The reality is, if we can project what we need to do with fixing relations and interests in Europe in the context of what's good for America as well. In other words, they want the European Union to have economic growth and to do more in terms of shouldering the burden for NATO. Well, we need to have economic growth and closer relations with European neighbours for that to work. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to meet an objective, stated objective, of the United States government. So phrasing stuff in the context of what matters to them and persuading them, if you can, which is back to the point about personal relationships, to adjust their fire in the light of new facts which they might not have thought about, will be a part of this. So lots of hard work to be done there. There will be bumpy surprises, and sometimes there will be stuff that's chucked out stream of consciousness which 2 days later doesn't actually turn out to be American policy. We shouldn't take every single utterance as being ex cathedra, but we do need to face up to the fact that it's going to be different, and to the extent we can, try to nudge and adjust where they are in a different direction to take account of what we think is in our interest in the context of what's in their interest too.
Thank you, Chair. In our earlier discussion on looking at the non-definition of the special relationship, I think David Manning raised one of the ingredients of that relationship as our relationship as far as nuclear weaponry is concerned. And perhaps we could delve a little deeper into that. We have an enormously close relationship with the US. They produce, they service the Trident missiles. We supply the warheads. And do you think, looking ahead, that that is going to remain the case in President Trump's efforts to decouple from Europe?
I see no reason at the moment to panic on this. I raised it because I think it would be wrong not to put this on the table. This is a key part of the special relationship. And if we're worried about what is its future direction and contours, it is an absolutely integral part. And the nuclear relationship, of course, it includes all sorts of aspects. It's not just Trident. But the fact is that it is absolutely vital to us, and we have to think about, what is that going to look like under President Trump? I mean, you can make the case that actually it's very convenient for the Americans because it's very useful for them. I mean, this is if we get into this argument about leverage, it's leverage, So why would you put this at risk? But I think in thinking about our defence posture, and I very much agree with Nigel and I think with Peter, who've spoken about the need to think hard about the European relationship, and to make the case that we need to develop that. We need to do that in parallel. Logically, that ought to be welcome in Washington. I think there is a question mark in my mind about how cooperating with Europe goes down with Trump and his entourage at all. I can't speak about Trump, but we've had it, J.D. Vance coming to Europe. We had Musk interfering in our internal politics. We know that there is much greater, let me put it like this, MAGA sympathy for the populists in Europe than there is for the moderates. And so calculating what the attitude to us, moving closer to Europe on defence or economically, and I'm sure Nigel's right, we need to do both, I think that's quite a difficult thing to get right. On the other hand, I don't see any signs at the moment that President Trump is threatening us over this, or that there's any inclination in the United States to call into doubt the nuclear agreement. But I think it would be wrong for you, if I dare say this to your committee, not at least to be thinking about if this relationship of trust and common view is in jeopardy, what might that mean?
Could I add a fact? The Mutual Defence Agreement is the 1958 original nuclear agreement, and it's renewed every so often. We have just renewed it, and we have renewed it indefinitely rather than on a 10-year cycle. So I think that's a piece of good news. I think as well the investment that is going in Britain and Australia to the AUKUS submarine development, matched of course by America, that also is a positive factor for the future.
Karen, was it renewed under Biden or Trump?
It was renewed under Biden, but the Trump camp, for want of a better word at the time, were informed about it.
Ernest Blackstone.
First of all, I'm terribly sorry I was late for the ridiculous reason that I've lost my phone. Anyway, that means I missed what you said at the beginning about the special relationship. But I just want to be slightly provocative about the way in which this debate has gone up until now. Because it seems to me that all of you, perhaps to slightly different degrees, are very, very committed to keeping the relationship with the United States pretty well as it is. And I wonder whether that can possibly happen whilst this divergence is so great and is likely to become greater, which I think one, if not two of you have said. And this brings then the issues of trust and values, which Lord Soames mentioned earlier. And I think there are three categories that will need to be taken into account in this context. The first is Parliament, and I think there's already a lot of restiveness amongst members of Parliament, particularly on the Labour side, about what is happening in the United States under President Trump. And that restiveness will continue if they perceive there's not enough toughness from their leader, our Prime Minister, in dealing with this response. And the second is the electorate, where we know from public opinion that there's a tremendous amount of sympathy with Ukraine, a lot of sympathy with the Palestinians, especially amongst young people, and this all affects their perception of the United States as well. But thirdly, our allies. The US is not our only ally. I've got a special interest in, or have had, because I used to be the chairman of the Franco-British Council, and we cannot at any point dismiss the importance of the French to us. They are our nearest neighbours, and they have been our allies and close allies for a very long time. The rest of the European Union, Germans, and so on, are also equally important. we mustn't forget Canada. Canada is under enormous threat at the moment, and I think they would expect the UK to take up their cause with the Americans, and very forcibly and publicly. We haven't yet really seen that. I also believe that there is a lot of scope, as more than one of you suggested, for a much closer relationship with the European Union on defence. We already have quite a close one with the French, and this is likely to grow. If that is the case, surely that can be seen in part as a move away from such dependence on the Americans on the defence and security front. And nothing is forever in this world. And if we're going to see this huge movement in terms of where the Americans stand on so many international issues, whether it's multilateralism, whether it's aid for developing countries, whether it's Russia, and I was going to raise Russia, and I'm extremely glad you did, because we've got a completely new position now from the United States on Russia, and it's not one that we hold, nor do any of our allies. So I want to ask whether you can't see a point where the conventional wisdom about this special relationship is really deeply threatened, and we should be talking about not only a reset with Europe, but a reset with the United States.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think the reset, I think a reset is going on. And I think the profundity of the challenge and what we've heard over the last few weeks has genuinely sunk in the UK, elsewhere in Europe, and so on. I don't think that that's in doubt. In terms of what it means, the incoming German Chancellor, just after the election, used the word independence from America. And I'm not sure that works either as the end state, and certainly not as the transitional state that we're in, or would work for the UK. Not complete independence. I think giving ourselves more options, trying to keep the best of the UK-US and transatlantic relationship, while at the same time finding other partnerships, particularly in Europe, who are still 50% of our trade and already have a lot of security and defence links. That, to me, is what we need to be aiming for. I also agree with you that foreign policy is the result of an often intangible sense of feeling in public opinion. And public opinion at different stages has had a negative opinion of developments in the US, of cultural change and differences between us. And that's very, very profound for obvious reasons today. And you've already seen in British public opinion polls a reduction of support and interest and liking for the United States, the same across Europe. That must affect the political environment in which ministers are going to operate if they want to have very, very close, sometimes risky, operational projects with the United States. There's nothing they can do about that unless there were a fundamental change of heart on the Trump side, which doesn't look very likely at the moment. But I agree with your fundamental point. I think we are at a turning point. But I think whether it's talking about a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine or about the nature of European security in a transitional 5 to 10 year phase, we're still going to need a lot of American involvement and support.
We're approaching, sorry, please go.
A brief word. I mean, just to say, we did talk a bit about Baroness Blackstone, some of those things that you mentioned. I don't think we were really saying keep the relationship as it is. I think what we were trying to say is that there are a number of ways in which we're going to have to face up to new realities, and we've got to learn to be a bit more transactional, rather in the way that the Trump administration is, and be pretty hard-headed about where our own interests lie. And I talked a bit about the threat posed to our security by the cozying up to Russia, and handing, if you like, Putin a number of negotiating points in advance of a negotiation even beginning over the heads of the Ukrainians. We had that in Afghanistan, and look how that ended. The Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban over the heads of the Afghan government, and it ended up with the mess that we've got now, even though he managed to try to blame Biden for it. So I think we're trying to understand the new realities, and I don't think we were saying keep it as it is. But we need to be transactional too, pragmatic, and at the moment, whether you're trying to deal with the security threats to Europe posed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine or whatever, America is an indispensable partner, to take the phrase that the Prime Minister has used. And it seemed to me that there was pretty widespread support for the way in which the Prime Minister was playing a kind of British role, not so much bridging, but if you like, trying to fix a problem that had broken out between different friends and partners and allies. And I think that is partly what the British public would like us to do, almost regardless of who is in power. And that is a role that we can play because of the fact that we are European and we're also a very close ally of the United States. So I don't think we're doing this starry-eyed because we want to hang on to nanny as if nothing has changed. We know that a lot has changed. And I couldn't agree with you more about what you say about engaging with our European partners. But I don't think President Macron, for example, in any way would want the Prime Minister not to try to use what relationships and influence he's got in Washington to make things better. He is doing the same thing. It is rather remarkable that even though post-Brexit we're outside the European Union, the political relationship with us and the French, and to some extent the Germans, though they're an unknown quantity at the moment, and Giorgia Meloni, a lot of the European partners, we are working extremely well. It's not either or, as we were saying before. It can be both and I think that has to be the right strategy for now.
Just to underscore, if I may, Peters, it's not a zero-sum game point, and I think that's very much how the Prime Minister sees it. And I think if you think back to January 2022, before Putin invaded Ukraine, you had the US and the Brits reading the intelligence in one sense, and Europe reading it in a very different sense. And in the end, it was the UK-US interpretation that was the correct one. Putin did invade. I can't see that fundamentally changing, so that you have a different people on different sides of the aisle. But I do think tech is one reason why the relationship with America will continue regardless of the relationships between Downing Street and the future White House. America's approach to tech and AI is so advanced compared to Europe's. We as Britain are the third largest AI sector in the world after the US and China, and the Prime Minister and the government are going to want to keep that. So I think, if you like, life itself, those technological innovations will keep us moving with America, even as the Prime Minister rightly builds up the relationship with Europe.
It is now midday. I've got two more people who would like to ask questions. Can we prevail upon your goodwill to stay for a few more minutes? Thank you so much, Baroness Cousins.
Thank you. Thank you. Going back to Baroness Fraser's question about international organisations, now that Trump has come out of, or has stated he wants to come out of the World Health Organization, can we expect any further disengagement from other UN agencies? Or looking at the possibilities for more positive action within the UN, do you think there's any scope or appetite for encouraging US, UK pragmatic cooperation where they have overlapping penholder responsibilities at the Security Council? I'm thinking in particular of Sudan. And on a separate question, but the same theme, what do we know, if anything, about Trump's attitude to the BRICS countries? BRICS being the bloc that seems to be expanding rather rapidly at the moment, including a number of major Commonwealth countries.
I think we will still keep a very broad dialogue with the United States, government to government, but also NGOs to NGOs, about a whole range of multilateral issues, even when, if the US pull out of various agencies, because you can't discuss global health threats. You would want to discuss a reaction to a future pandemic with the United States, regardless of whether they were following WHO rules or not. And I think the nature of American programming, but we'll have to see where the review of American programs gets to, does allow them to still participate individually in different ventures. So I could see that happening on a range of issues currently dealt with by the UN agencies. For example, it may not, WHO may not be the last pull-out, but I do think you can keep the dialogue going. And in fact, in Trump 1, we were able to do that. On the BRICS countries, the Trump administration tends to deal with them individually rather than as a bloc. You'll know that President Trump has a very warm relationship with Modi, for example. And the relationship with India and the US is one that's only grown stronger under both administrations over the past few years. So I think they will continue to want to do that on a bilateral basis rather than try and engage with them as a bloc.
What about cooperation over the penholder responsibilities? I just wonder if that relationship can be leveraged when it comes to, a challenge like the war in Sudan, whether the US and the UK have got the potential to work together in a pragmatic way to actually achieve something.
Oh, definitely. There's no suggestion that I've seen that they would not want to cooperate with us, and indeed with France as the P3, the Western members of the Permanent Five, on a range of issues. And the Foreign Secretary has raised Sudan in particular with Secretary Rubio, and I think we'll be able to find a good way forward at the UN together.
Maybe just a final comment from any or all of you about on the experience of Trump first presidency, how this one might go. I've heard it sort of said that we're almost at the end of the pre-scripted bit of his administration, where he's come in with 60 days of shock and awe, and there are some natural checks and balances as the administration goes through, the midterms arrive and all this, and we're at sort of peak chaos. And can you offer any sort of sense of abatement in this, where even within the back end of his presidency there may be an element of return to some normality because his power is somehow constrained? Or do you think he might be hell-bent on remaining unconstrained?
Maybe perhaps one comment. I think that it is worth remembering that, the United States is a federal country. So there are a lot of state authorities that may or may not see eye to eye with his programs and will put up resistance, I suspect, to some of them. I think there is the Congress, which so far has been accused anyway by the FT yesterday of missing in action. But his majorities in those two houses are very slim. And they do have the midterm elections coming along. It's not to say that Trump will lose them. But I think, Congress isn't necessarily going to accept everything he wants to do. And I'm sure it's worthwhile of people, not least on your committee, talking to your American counterparts in Congress. And as ambassador, I'm very keen that parliamentarians on both sides should remain really engaged with each other, because I think you can have an impact. And to the point that, an awful lot of Americans don't know about Europe and really don't understand our point of view, you can make a real impact. I think there's the judiciary, that this is also, but I think above all, for me, what will count for Trump is what the markets decide. And we've touched on tariffs. But if the markets decide that they're really losing confidence in the Trump administration, then there will be, I think, there's the possibility of quite serious pushback by business, who are going to be worried about their profits and their shareholders and all sorts of other things. And the bond market in particular cannot be legislated or dictated to. So I think, will the Trump economic policy produce lower growth, higher inflation, disappointed people in Trump states? I think all of that is possible. But I think it's very, very hard to say. But at the moment, I think we're in a situation where, they are triumphant. They are carrying all before them. I mean, I'm not a politician. There are plenty of people in this room who are. Politics doesn't usually continue like that for very long. And I suspect that, things will start to get more difficult and go wrong. And that the Congress will find its voice, and so will business, and so will other players. And so I think imagining that at the moment this is how it's always going to be for the next 4 years is probably a mistake. I'm sure that's how they would like it to be, but whether it will actually turn out like that, I'm sceptical.
I wouldn't count on it. It would be lovely to believe we're at the peak. Maybe it's like peak oil a few years ago. I suspect quite a lot of it will continue, because I think it's a different world order that he envisages, and I think it's a different way of doing politics nationally and internationally. I think you saw it again last night. Maybe it's a matter of degree, but this was another campaigning speech. It wasn't a governing speech. And the way in which the politics of campaigning are being transferred to America's international relations is, to me, one of the very important and very regrettable medium-term issues that we're facing, not least in relation to their attack on Europe and the use of powerful social media to push European politics in a particular direction. So I think it's a way of operating which I can't see him becoming a president who goes away at the weekend and spends his equivalent of time reading his box. It doesn't feel to me that it's going to be that sort of presidency. It's going to carry on being a presidency conducted in the public eye, with policy being made on the hoof, though some of that may abate somewhat. On David's checks and balances, I think on the basis of the first 6 weeks, it really does depend on the courts. And we've got to hope that the courts, including the Supreme Court, offer that check, because for the time being, I think there's not very much in on the political side. And I think American business opinion is more muted, more concerned today than it was in 2017. In 2017, there was that sugar rush. There was the feeling that they were onto something, that the economy would do very well on the back of the tax cuts and other changes. I think today, because of tariffs, because of the hollowing out of the public space, which I think works at a general level of deregulation, but people worry about the detail. They worry about the funding, for example, for American universities and research. All these things, I think, make American business uncertain, probably supportive as much as they can be. But if you look at the markets, they've taken a tumble actually in the last few weeks.
I think you have to remember that President Trump has put his finger on something that the American people deeply feel. He won every swing state. He got, for the first time, a popular majority. It's been put to me by members of the Senate that part of the reason for this is because America has never faced, at least since 1814, an adversary with as strong an economy as America has. They've always had the upper hand economically. And now in China, they have a different sort of adversary, and they have not yet calibrated exactly how they want to deal with that. So some of what President Trump is doing, some of what is happening on the business and economic side is, I think, a response to that visceral feeling of things not being quite where America wants them to be. And then, as Nigel and David mentioned, some of the executive orders he has issued have gone straight into the courts or other parts of the checks and balances system. And we will need to see what's done about those, whether the courts decide them, whether they put them up through the system. But there is also a difference of philosophy, if you like, in the Trump administration about the powers of the president legally and constitutionally. And that is a debate that America will need to have with itself.
A couple of tiny things to add. The courts and the judges, yes, but some of them are, of course, Trump appointees. He's got a Republican majority in the Supreme Court that gave him essentially presidential immunity, more sweeping than most people would have expected. Generally, both in that respect and in the way in which he has filled the administration with appointees who are there for loyalty rather than necessarily competence, he was ready to win. Last time round he was surprised, and there were a whole lot of people who came from more traditional Reagan Republican backgrounds who served for a while, and some got spat out, some resigned, didn't work out, but they did operate to some extent as a constraint. I do not see much at the moment in the way of constraints other than, as Karen says, markets, and some of the Trump voters who might find that they're out of a job or out of an income and will eventually conclude that those are the result of his policies. As for the Congress, Yes, I mean, the arithmetic that I've seen suggests that it's inconceivable that the Republicans would lose the Senate, but there's a good chance that they will lose the House. But that presupposes that the Democrats begin to get their act together, and so far they haven't done a brilliant job of that.
Well, thank you very much indeed for giving us a very sound base on which to proceed with our inquiry. We may need to come and ask you to speak to us again towards the end.
Probably not.
See how things have developed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.